Before I moved to the Philippines, I kept hearing the same number, $1,000 a month. Rent, food, transportation, visa extensions. I figured if I could stay around that number, I could give the Philippines one full year without burning through my savings. 12 months later, I added everything up. A little over 900,000 pesos, roughly $16,000. So I was off by a few thousand. And what surprised me was where the money went. It wasn't one huge emergency. It was deposits, a hotel while I looked for a condo, stuff for the apartment, grab rides, imported groceries, visa fees, and a bunch of little mistakes that didn't feel expensive until I added them together. I also thought immigration was going to be the stressful part. It wasn't. Finding a decent rental was harder. So if you're thinking about coming here for 6 months, a year, or maybe longer, I'm going to walk you through my first year exactly the way it happened. What I paid for rent, electricity, food, transportation, and visas. What I wish I'd packed. And the mistakes I'd avoid if I were arriving tomorrow. Because a few of those mistakes cost me real money. My plan was pretty simple. I had a little under $30,000 saved, but I didn't want to spend anywhere close to all of it. I figured the year would cost me around $12,000 to $14,000, and the rest would stay there as a safety net. At the time, that felt like plenty. Then I started looking for a place to live. The first mistake I made was thinking I could figure out my housing before I arrived. I spent weeks looking at condo listings online, Facebook Marketplace, rental groups, property websites. I had screenshots saved on my phone of maybe 20 different places. Every night I'd look at them and think, okay, this one looks good, this one has a gym, this one has a balcony, this one is only 20,000 pesos. I thought I had it all narrowed down. Then I got here, and probably half of those listings were useless. Some were already rented. A few people never answered. One agent replied to me 3 days later and asked if I wanted to see a completely different property that cost almost twice as much. Another listing had apparently been online for months, even though the unit wasn't available anymore. That was the first lesson I learned. If I were doing this again, I would not try to lock myself into a long-term rental before I was physically in the Philippines. Photos don't tell you enough, and neither does the price. I booked a small hotel for 2 weeks instead. That cost me a little more than I wanted to spend, but it ended up being one of the smarter decisions I made. It gave me time to actually look around, and once I started visiting rentals in person, I realized how different a place can feel compared with the photos. One condo looked almost perfect online. Good furniture, nice kitchen, big windows. Then I walked in and heard drilling through the wall. There was construction going on in the unit next door. The agent told me it would probably be finished soon. I had no idea what soon meant, and I wasn't interested in finding out. Another place was cheaper, but the air conditioner looked ancient. I asked them to turn it on, and after about 10 minutes, the room still felt warm. That might not sound like a big deal if you've never lived here, but once you've spent an afternoon walking around in the heat, you start paying attention to air conditioners. The next condo had decent air conditioning, but the water pressure was terrible. Then I found one I actually liked. It wasn't fancy. It was a one-bedroom condo, furnished, in a building that felt well-maintained. There was a small kitchen, a washing machine, decent internet options in the building, and I could walk to a grocery store. The rent was 22,000 pesos a month. At the time, that was roughly $400. And that number sounded great to me. 22,000. I thought, that's it. Housing problem solved. Except 22,000 pesos was not what I needed to move in. The owner wanted 1 month in advance and 2 months security deposit. So right away, I needed 66,000 pesos. Then there were a few small fees and the things I needed to buy after moving in. Sheets, pillows, towels, a rice cooker, a fan, a water dispenser, cleaning supplies, a couple of pans, plates, extension cords, a decent surge protector. All the little things you don't think about when you're looking at a furnished condo online. By the end of that first week in the unit, I had spent close to 80,000 pesos between getting the lease started and making the place actually comfortable. That was over $1,000 gone almost immediately, and none of it felt like I had bought anything exciting. I had a security deposit and a pile of household stuff. That's when I started realizing the first year wasn't going to follow the neat little monthly budget I had made before coming over. And there was another thing I wish somebody had told me about renting here. Don't just inspect the condo. Inspect the life you're going to have around the condo. I went back to the building at night before I signed. That turned out to be useful. I wanted to know if the street was noisy. I wanted to see how bright the area was. I checked my phone signal inside the unit. I asked what internet providers serviced the building. I asked whether the association dues were included in the rent. They were. That mattered because I had looked at another place where the advertised rent seemed cheaper until I found out there were additional monthly dues. I also asked the owner what the previous tenant usually paid for electricity. That answer should have made me pay more attention. He said somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 pesos. I remember thinking that sounded high. My first full electric bill was almost 7,000. And that was completely my fault. For the first month, I treated the air conditioner like I was still living in the United States. If I was home, it was running. Sometimes I'd leave it on while I went downstairs to grab food because I didn't want to come back to a hot room. I didn't think much about it. Then the bill showed up. 6,800 and something pesos. I checked it twice because I thought I was reading it wrong. That was probably the moment when I stopped converting everything into dollars and saying, well, that's still cheap. Because that habit can get you in trouble here. A $20 mistake is still a mistake. And if you make 5 or 6 of those every month, suddenly your cheap life isn't quite as cheap as you expected. The next month, I changed how I used the AC, started using the fan more, and stopped cooling the condo when I wasn't actually in it. My electric bill came down to just under 5,000 pesos. Water was almost nothing compared with that. Internet was another expense I was happy to pay, because I wanted a reliable connection and didn't want to depend on mobile data. But food? Food was where I made my next big mistake. Food was the part of my budget I thought I understood before I got here. I kept hearing that groceries were cheap, and they can be, but I learned pretty quickly that it depends on what you're buying. My first couple of grocery trips looked almost exactly like they would have back home. Imported cereal, cheese, peanut butter, coffee, beef, snacks I recognized, a few frozen things. I wasn't doing it on purpose. I was just reaching for familiar food because everything else in my life was already new. Then I looked at what I had spent. My first full month, I was close to 18,000 pesos just on groceries. That didn't include restaurants. That caught me off guard. I had expected food to be one of the places where I saved the most money. Instead, I was spending more than I needed to because I was trying to recreate my American grocery cart in the Philippines. It took me a couple of months to figure that out. I started buying more chicken instead of beef, more eggs, rice, local bread, fruit that was actually in season, vegetables from smaller markets. I stopped automatically buying imported versions of things when there was a local option sitting right beside it for half the price. And I started paying attention to where I shopped. That made a bigger difference than I expected. By the time I had been here a few months, I had my groceries down closer to 12,000 pesos a month. Some months a little more, some less. But I wasn't eating badly. I had just stopped paying extra for familiarity. There were still a few things I refused to give up. Coffee was one of them. I'm not moving across the Pacific just to drink coffee I don't like every morning. But I became more selective about what I was willing to pay extra for. Eating out was another adjustment. At first I thought, Restaurants are cheaper here, so I'll just eat out whenever I want. And individually, a meal might not seem expensive. 200 pesos here, 300 there, a coffee, a delivery fee, a snack while you're out. Then you order dinner because it's raining and you don't feel like leaving. Do that enough times, and you've spent another 7,000 or 8,000 pesos without feeling like you did anything. That was when I stopped telling myself, it's only a few dollars. One cheap meal didn't matter. One grab ride didn't matter. But when I did that over and over, it added up fast. The Philippines could still be affordable. I just had to pay attention. Once I had the condo settled and my food spending under control, I felt like I was finally getting into a routine. Then I got my reminder that I needed to deal with immigration. Before I came here, the visa side of living in the Philippines confused me more than almost anything else. I had read forum posts, watched videos, saw people arguing online about dates and extensions, and I had made it sound much more complicated in my head than it really was. My initial stay was limited, so before that period ran out, I handled my first extension. I did that one online. I remember sitting at my little table in the condo with my passport next to me, checking every number about 3 times before I submitted anything. I was worried I'd type one digit wrong and somehow create a disaster. Nothing dramatic happened. I submitted it, paid the required amount through the system, and once it was processed, I had more time. That was it. And that first extension gave me a false sense of confidence. Because when I got closer to the point where I had been in the country around 2 months, I found out I needed to deal with my ACR I-Card. That meant I couldn't just sit in the condo and click through everything the same way. I had to go to an immigration office. And for some reason, that made me nervous. Not because anyone had done anything to me, I just didn't know what to expect. So I did what people do when they're worried about paperwork. I over-prepared. I had my passport, photocopies, extra copies of things, a pen, another pen in case the first pen stopped working, my phone charged, screenshots saved, and I showed up early, probably way earlier than I needed to. The process was much less dramatic than I had imagined. I filled out what they needed, gave them the information for my stay, handled the extension, and went through the ACR I-Card process. There was also the photo and identification part of it. It took longer than doing an extension from my couch, obviously, but I walked out of there thinking, that's what I was worried about? The biggest thing I learned was to not treat immigration like something you deal with at the last possible minute. Put your expiration date in your phone. Set another reminder ahead of it. Keep a folder with your passport copies and whatever documents you regularly use. And check the official information instead of relying on a video somebody made 3 years ago. Rules and procedures can change. After that, immigration stopped feeling like this big mystery. I kept my expiration dates in my phone, set reminders before they were due, and handled extensions online when I could. If I had to go in person, I went in person. I also started keeping visa money separate from my normal monthly budget. That helped because an extension wasn't suddenly taking money away from groceries or electricity. It was just another expense I knew was coming. And that was a big part of getting comfortable here. Once I stopped treating every visa extension like some new problem, it became routine. By about my 4th month, I stopped feeling like I was visiting. I had a grocery store I liked. I knew where I usually got cash. I had a couple of places I liked to eat, and I had a pretty good idea what a grab ride should cost before I booked it. Little things that used to take planning didn't anymore. That was when the Philippines started feeling less like a trip and more like the place I was living. And around the same time, I realized I had packed completely wrong. But that also brought up another problem I didn't expect. I had packed for the Philippines like I was coming on a very long vacation. I had not packed like I was actually going to live here. There is a difference. I brought too many clothes I barely wore. A jacket that spent almost the entire year in the closet. Shoes that didn't make sense for the heat. And way too many little things I could have bought here without any trouble. But there were also a few things I was very glad I brought. One was a backup bank card. I kept it separate from my wallet. That ended up mattering later. Another was an extra pair of prescription glasses. I also brought copies of important documents, both on paper and stored digitally. And I brought a good quality surge protector for some of my electronics. If I were arriving again, I would probably bring less clothing and spend more suitcase space on the handful of things I know I personally like and might have trouble replacing. Especially if you wear a larger shoe size or use a very specific medication or personal care product. But I wouldn't bring an entire American household with me. You can buy almost everything you need after you arrive. There is one thing I would bring more of, though. Patience. And I'm not saying that as some inspirational quote. I mean actual patience. Because around month 5, I had one of those weeks where everything that had been easy suddenly wasn't. My internet went down. I had a problem with my bank card. And I learned that when somebody tells you they'll be there later, you may need to ask what later means. That week taught me more about adjusting to life here than my first 4 months combined. Month 5 gave me one of those weeks where a few small problems all showed up at once. First, my internet went out. I restarted the router. Then I restarted it again because apparently the second restart is supposed to fix what the first one didn't. It didn't. Other people in the building were down too, so I ended up using my phone as a hotspot. After that, I made sure I always had enough mobile data to get online if the home connection went out. Then, a couple days later, my main debit card got declined at an ATM. I tried another machine. Same thing. There was money in the account, I just couldn't get to it. That's when the backup card I had packed finally mattered. I used it until I got the problem sorted out, and after that I stopped keeping every card in the same wallet. I kept one at home and enough cash around to get through a few days. Nothing dramatic happened, but that week showed me why having a backup for the boring stuff matters when you're living in another country. Transportation was another thing I had to figure out. When I first arrived, I used Grab constantly. It was easy. I didn't have to explain where I was going very much. I could see the price before the ride. And when you're new, convenience is worth something. The problem was, I started using it for everything. A short trip to the grocery store, a coffee, going to the mall, a restaurant that really wasn't that far away. Individually, those rides weren't expensive, but I went back through 1 month and realized I had spent several thousand pesos just moving around town. That was another category I hadn't really budgeted for. So I started walking when it made sense. I learned some of the local transportation options. I combined errands instead of making 3 separate trips. And I stopped taking a car somewhere just because the app made it easy. That brought my transportation spending down to around 4,000 pesos in a normal month. Some months were higher, especially if I went somewhere farther away, but at least I knew where the money was going. By then, I was finally seeing how the budget really worked. Cheap rent didn't automatically mean a cheap month. Neither did cheap food or a cheap ride. It was all of it together, plus the little stuff I never planned for: a charger, medicine, a fan, an extra trip across town. None of those things were a big deal by themselves, but they were still part of living here. Then I reached about the halfway point of my first year. That was when I had another immigration visit. In my case, I needed to handle part of my extension in person rather than doing everything online. By then, it didn't bother me at all. I knew where the office was, I knew to go before my deadline, I knew what documents I normally carried. And I wasn't standing there worried that I had somehow misunderstood the entire process. That was a good feeling, because 6 months earlier, even the words visa extension made me nervous. Now, it was just something on my calendar. Around the halfway point, I also noticed I had adjusted to a lot of things without really thinking about it. The heat was still hot. I just stopped doing dumb things like planning a long walk in the middle of the afternoon. I went out earlier or later, carried water, wore lighter clothes, and sometimes paid for a short ride because showing up soaked in sweat wasn't worth saving a couple of dollars. The noise took longer. Dogs, motorcycles, construction, karaoke when I wasn't in the mood for karaoke, and, depending on where you live, a rooster that seems to have no idea what time sunrise is. After a while, most of it became background noise. But it also made me realize how important it is to check a rental at different times of day. Stand outside, open the windows, listen. If there's a busy road, construction, or an empty lot next door, pay attention to it before you sign anything. I also got used to the occasional short power interruption. I bought a small power bank, kept my phone charged, and used surge protection on the electronics I cared about. None of that is exciting advice, but it's the kind of stuff that makes everyday life easier. By month 7 or 8, my spending had finally become predictable. Rent was 22,000 pesos. Electricity usually stayed around 4,000 to 5,000, depending on how much I used the AC. Water was only a few hundred pesos. Internet was under 2,000. My phone and data were less than 1,000 most months. Groceries averaged around 12,000. Eating out was usually 6,000 or 7,000 if I paid attention. Transportation was around 4,000. Then I kept another few thousand for household stuff, laundry, medicine, entertainment, and whatever random expense showed up. Most normal months came out somewhere around 60,000 pesos, give or take. And that was the point where I finally understood why two people can make completely different videos about what it costs to live in the Philippines, and both of them can technically be telling the truth. One person cooks every meal, lives outside a major city, doesn't use much air conditioning, and spends 40,000 pesos. Someone else rents a modern condo, eats Western food, uses Grab everywhere, goes out several nights a week, and spends 100,000. Neither one tells you what you're going to spend. Your habits do. That was probably the most important financial lesson of my first year. The Philippines didn't force me to spend a certain amount. It gave me choices. And some of those choices were much cheaper than what I was used to. Others weren't. Imported food was one. Electricity was another. And if you start upgrading your lifestyle because everything seems inexpensive individually, you can blow through money very quickly. There was one expense I hadn't included at all when I made my original one-year plan: travel inside the Philippines. I kept telling myself I was here to live, not take a 12-month vacation. But after being here for several months, it felt ridiculous to stay in the same neighborhood every day. So I started taking a few short trips. Nothing luxurious. A flight here, a hotel for a couple of nights, a ferry, some meals, entrance fees. And suddenly, there was another category in the budget. I don't regret those trips at all, but they did push my first-year total higher. The funny part was, I still didn't know how far over my original budget I had gone. I wouldn't find that out until month 12, when I finally sat down and added everything together. By month 9, I wasn't really counting how long I'd been in the Philippines anymore. At the beginning, I knew exactly what day I was on. Day 30, day 59, 3 months, 6 months. Later on, I had to look at the calendar. I think that's a good sign. It meant I wasn't waiting for the experiment to end. I was just living here. But I was still tracking my expenses because I wanted to know whether that original $1,000 a month idea had ever become realistic. And by then, it actually had. Not every month, but a normal month for me was usually somewhere around 60,000 pesos. The problem was that a normal month wasn't the whole story. There were visa expenses throughout the year. I usually extended for 2 months at a time once I got into the regular routine. The amount wasn't identical every single time because different fees came up at different stages, especially when the ACR I-Card was involved. So instead of pretending my visa cost me one neat monthly number, I started setting money aside for immigration separately. For somebody doing what I was doing, I would personally budget somewhere around 35 to 40,000 pesos for immigration-related expenses over a full year and be happy if I came in under it. And I'd check the Bureau of Immigration's current fees before making that budget, because those are exactly the kinds of numbers that can change. The important thing for me wasn't memorizing every fee. It was making sure the money was already there when an extension came up. That way, I didn't suddenly have a 5 or 6,000 peso expense and wonder what category it was supposed to come from. That was another big difference by month 10. Rent, electricity, and visa extensions weren't surprises anymore. I knew they were coming, so I had money set aside before they showed up. Nothing had actually become cheaper. I had just gotten better at planning for it. Then I reached month 12. I had told myself from the beginning that this was when I would make the decision: stay another year or go back to the United States. And before I made that decision, I wanted to know exactly what this experiment had cost me. So I pulled up my bank statements and started adding: rent, utilities, food, transportation, immigration, hotels from when I first arrived, trips I took during the year, furniture and household things, every stupid little purchase I could remember. It took a while. And when I finished, I got the number I mentioned at the beginning: a little over 900,000 pesos, roughly $16,000. I had expected 12 to 14. So now I finally knew how far I'd missed my budget. The interesting part was why. My regular monthly lifestyle wasn't the reason. Once I was established, I really was living somewhere around that $1,000 a month range. The extra money was mostly in the beginning and in the things that didn't happen every month: temporary accommodation, setting up the condo, travel, immigration, buying things twice because I bought the cheap version first and hated it, and the security deposit on my condo. Technically, I hadn't spent all of that deposit because I could potentially get it back when I moved out, but it still mattered when I calculated how much cash I needed during my first year. That's something I think gets overlooked. There is a difference between your monthly cost of living and the amount of money you need to move here. Those are not the same number. If somebody asked me today, can I live in the Philippines on $1,000 a month? I'd say maybe. I did some months. But if somebody asked me, can I move to the Philippines with $12,000 and comfortably make it through my first year? That's a very different question. I would want more breathing room than that. If I landed in the Philippines tomorrow and had to do my first year again, I'd change 5 things. First, I'd still book a hotel or Airbnb for at least 2 weeks. I would not sign a year-long lease from the United States based on photos. I'd look at the unit myself, turn on the air conditioner, run the shower, check the water pressure, listen for noise, ask about internet, ask if association dues are included, and most important, find out the full move-in amount, not just the monthly rent. Second, I'd bring more than one way to get money. 2 cards if possible, and I wouldn't keep them together. I'd also keep a little cash at home so one ATM problem doesn't turn into an emergency. Third, I'd pack less, way less. You can buy most normal things here. I'd use suitcase space for the stuff that's harder for me personally to replace. Prescription glasses, a specific medication or product I really use. Shoes if I wear a size that's harder to find. I definitely would not bring half of Walmart with me. Fourth, I'd stay ahead of immigration. I'd put my dates in my phone, set reminders, check the official information, and handle each extension before I'm right up against the deadline. The process stopped stressing me out once I quit leaving it in the back of my mind and just treated it like a bill on the calendar. And fifth, I'd bring more money than my perfect little spreadsheet says I need. The first few months cost more because you're new. You take rides you won't take later. You shop at the wrong places. You buy things for the condo. You pay for convenience because you don't know the cheaper way yet. That's part of learning. The other thing I'd stop doing is comparing my budget with every foreigner online. If somebody lives on 40,000 pesos a month, good for them. Maybe they don't use much air conditioning. Maybe their rent is cheaper. Maybe they cook every meal. I'm not them. I wasn't trying to win a contest for who could live here the cheapest. I was trying to build a life I actually wanted to stay in. So after 1 full year, did I stay? Yeah, I did. And the reason wasn't that everything had been perfect. It wasn't. There were days when the heat irritated me, days when the internet went out at the worst possible time, times when I missed food from home, times when something that should have taken 20 minutes somehow became a half-day project. I had moments when I wondered whether living abroad was worth dealing with all the little adjustments. But those weren't the majority of my days. Most days became pretty ordinary. I woke up, made coffee, checked my phone, went grocery shopping, worked on my laptop, complained about the electric bill, ordered food when I was too lazy to cook, talked to people back home, went out sometimes, stayed home other times. It stopped feeling like I was living in this exotic place on the other side of the world. It was just where I lived. And that's the part I couldn't really learn from YouTube before I came here. You can watch condo tours and budget videos all day, but your first few months are still going to teach you things nobody can completely prepare you for. Your first grocery bill might be too high. Your first electric bill might make you change how you use the AC. You might spend too much on Grab because you don't know your way around yet. That's normal. By the end of my first year, I wasn't doing everything perfectly. I was just making fewer dumb mistakes than I made at the beginning. And year 2 already looked easier because the setup costs were behind me. So, if you're planning your own move, don't only ask, can I live there for $1,000 a month? Ask what it's going to cost to arrive, what it's going to cost to get into a rental, how you're going to access your money, how much you'll keep for emergencies, and whether you have enough room in the budget to learn as you go. That's the number I wish I had thought about before I came here. Would I do it again? Absolutely. I just wouldn't bring that jacket. It has been hanging in the same spot for 12 months, and I still have no idea why I thought I needed it. If you're already living in the Philippines, I'm curious what surprised you during your first year. And if you're thinking about moving here, what's the one thing you're still trying to figure out? Maybe somebody who's already done it can help you in the comments. Thanks for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next one.